Miles, who's the executive director of New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. Melissa has spent her career fighting for her communities. She's a resident of Ironbound in Newark and is going to talk to us about what brought her here to this work. And we're going to have a conversation with her afterwards. Melissa.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you for inviting me. So happy to be here with you all. So just a little bit about me. Actually, I will talk about myself throughout this because that's my connection with this work is deeply personal. I would not be here if it weren't for the very personal ways in which both climate and people have impacted my life. So you will hear about my life throughout this. But just a quick intro. I am Melissa Miles. I'm the executive director of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. I'm actually based in Summit. The first place I lived in New Jersey, because I am a native New Yorker, was Jersey City, where my parents have been for, I guess, about 35 years now. So Jersey City was my entry point into New Jersey, and then Newark, where I lived for over a decade. Newark remains my organizing home. It is the place where I first really began to connect with, environmental justice as a way of life. And now I'm based in Summit. I have been here with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance for 6 years this summer. And before that, I was a manager, and before that, an organizer, and before that, a community member of the Ironbound Community Corporation. And as I mentioned, I do this work mainly because it intersected with my life. So I was not on a trajectory to do climate work. My background is in youth development and out of school time programming and college prep, and I still love that to my core. And I am here mainly because I was powerfully called into this work, and I answered it and continue to answer that call every day, despite the challenges. So I also just want to take a minute just to give some people respect, because I feel like it's very important to locate myself in, in an ecosystem of people, because I didn't just pop up doing EJ work, and I'm definitely not an expert on infrastructure or water infrastructure. There are many people who've taught me along the way. So I just want to give them their respect, and any mistakes or strange things were mine. But folks like Paul Goulet from Columbia Climate School, who we've worked with for many years, the organizations We Act and Uprose in New York, Marjorie Kaplan at the Rutgers Climate Resource Center, Nick Angarone at NJEJA, Lucas Markson and Garen Bolger, both from Rutgers, who we're currently working with, and of course, the board of the New Jersey Environmental Alliance, who were some of the first people I really saw doing work after Sandy. And I'm going to get more into that as I go on. So next slide, please. The New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance is a statewide EJ organization. What we do is we work with communities on the ground, mainly community-based organizations that are base-building organizations that have accountability to individuals in their communities, to help them to respond to issues regarding, just their daily quality of life. Our bread and butter has always been energy, air pollution, transportation, and waste infrastructure. We are one of, as far as I know, the only organizations in the state that actively watchdog permits coming through the DEP's permitting system for those Title V facilities. Those are the major polluters. And we do so many more things. Just please go to our website or our socials and you'll see. We've been around for over 20 years now, so we have very deep roots in New Jersey. We're also very deeply connected with the larger EJ movement throughout the country. I sit on several national boards, which means that, so as goes New Jersey, so goes the country. People are constantly watching what we are doing here. and what we do, what we don't do. We are held accountable by other EJ organizations across the state, or across the country, rather. Next slide, please. So these are our socials. We can probably bring them back up at the end for folks that want to take a picture of the QR or go on to our socials, but we'll just get started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the trajectory of my experience with the devastating impacts of flooding on Black and of color and low-income communities, and the community-led advocacy and activism that grew out of those, devastating moments. Because in the environmental justice movement, we really believe that the people who are most impacted are those that are most equipped to, lead the struggle to rebuild in more just ways. We don't want just to snap back to the way things were, because the way things have been historically is unjust. So we're really, our struggle is for better, is for more community cohesion, for more voice, for more resource, and just a better future for our communities. Next slide. So my first interaction was 5 years post-Katrina, when I was still in youth development. I had a chance to go to Louisiana and really talk with people on the ground. That was when I first learned about the man-made natural disaster. That's when I first began to realize that, what is often framed as Mother Nature, or, there was nothing that could be done, and, it just took us by surprise, that actually what we see and, what we have been seeing when it comes to climate shocks are unfortunately by design. So do we know exactly when things are going to happen? No. But the conditions that exist that produce the outcomes, the devastating outcomes, are very much by design. And the place that I learned that on the ground was 5 years post-Katrina in New Orleans. And yeah, next slide, please. As part of that trip, I got to meet the director of this film, Trouble the Water. Now there are dozens of films about Katrina and what happened, but at that point, even 5 years post, the true narrative still was not largely understood. But of course, people in New Orleans knew exactly what happened, right? They were there, they heard it, they saw it, they lived it, and they also were living the results of what happens in what we now call disaster capitalism. So a lot of work is currently being done by groups on the ground in New Orleans, to keep that legacy alive and to continue to struggle for the future that they want to see for their communities. Next slide. So my own first experience with flooding was during Superstorm Sandy, and this slide is actually a board member of both ICC and New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, Dr. Ana Bautista. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about Sandy and the Ironbound a little bit later. So we can move on to the next slide. And just, a little bit of background for those of you who may not be from the area. Sandy hit in October 2012, was a Category 3. I myself at that time was, if you want, you can go back to the last slide, I'm sorry. I was living in Newark with my 6-month-old, my niece and her 3-year-old, and we were woefully underprepared for what was to come. And for me, that year, 2012, is really what changed my life and really solidly put me on the trajectory to being an environmental justice advocate, because that was a time where in my personal life, I saw how climate and environmental burden would sort of collide in my own life while living in Newark, and the things that I had learned from organizers the things that happen to you when you live in a climate burdened community, in an EJ community. I began to see in my own life and in the lives of those around me. And so, that year, it was a terrible year, but it was a year that sort of really called me into this work. Okay, we can move on. Thank you. So, the next big moment for me was 2017 with Hurricane Maria. By 2017, I'm sort of firmly in the work. And at that point, like I said, I'd already been to New Orleans. I was very familiar with the narratives of climate disaster, climate capitalism, sort of the swoop in economics that happen after climate disasters, where people are sort of both abused and displaced. And so I was, fortunate enough to be in community with folks who were in Puerto Rico, who were based in Puerto Rico, and really, to see the movement that has, developed with folks, the sort of at the intersection of race and class and activism. And this shot here is from a documentary called PR on the Map. That was produced by Dr. Rosa Clemente, who is a scholar on Black and Puerto Rican activism. I just had the opportunity to take a course with her that I'm hoping to bring to Newark, because I think it would be really amazing. But, basically, again, we see people exercising their voice and their sovereignty in the wake of climate disasters. So that is kind of part of the truth of folks that have been through these disasters, is that, you don't want to just snap back. You really want to be made whole, because these communities were not whole prior. And that's why, the disasters hit so hard. Next slide. And so this is just another clip from their website, PR on the Map. Next slide. So I'm sure many of you also remember Ida, which was really sort of like a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of New Jersey, because so many people died, because it came, we really saw clearly that people in urban communities, which, were not really thought of as being as flood prone and as at risk of flooding as they actually are. We saw people in urban communities die during Ida. And also, one sort of intersecting piece is the FEMA response. Through all of these different pieces, we see that New Jersey and other communities have really had difficulty getting the type of response and care that they were expecting by FEMA after these disasters. So we can only imagine what it will be like now that FEMA's been defunded in such a way. So, Hurricane Ida also, in Elizabeth and Union County, 5 people died, 4 of them in a flooded basement apartment. And these basement apartments are really like a reality of many of our urban communities. And so, it was just really, I think, shocking and devastating, but the signs were there. It wasn't, again, a lot of where we live, how we live as EJ communities is by design. And I also just want to take a moment to uplift the work of the New Jersey Organizing Project that is working with folks in South Jersey still around Sandy recovery, around Ida recovery, because there have been so many ripple effects in the lives, not just property, but insurance, folks' ability to get insurance or not. You talk about places like Atlantic City, where, we see that that folks who are not being able to renew their insurance. So, there's still a lot of damage happening even now from these storms, because, finance, insurance, and real estate, they have adjusted and responded more quickly than sort of like our public infrastructure has. Next slide, please. So going back to Sandy, just want to thank Ironbound Community Corporation for making this slide deck publicly available on some of what they did during Sandy, and also just have to name another board member of ours, Cynthia Mayone, who, you know, was the organizer on the ground with Ironbound during Superstorm Sandy, and also a friend of mine at that time. So I really got to witness you know, the work that was being done, and it was so much work. It was so much work. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. So I was, like I said, a new mom, kind of witnessing this on the ground, this massive response from a local community org, Ironbound Community Corporation. And from what I could see, they were sort of like the first responders, documenting and helping before FEMA even arrived. And so, you know, this is just a piece of a resource that they put together, documenting some of what happened and their response. So as you can see on this map, that dark line is the Passaic River. It's a tidal river. And so it flows two ways, but one of those sides is into the Newark Bay. Between the two blue arrows, we have the lower 8 miles of the Passaic River. And this, again, is another point where we see climate risk meeting environmental burden, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, because the lower 8 miles of the Passaic is a designated federal Superfund site. And it's one of the largest sites and one of the most expensive cleanups. And we have folks who, you know, maybe on this call or maybe not, who are on the Passaic River CAG. So that process continues to today. So, you know, I mentioned Dr. Anna Baptista, she said to me, like, our grandkids will probably not swim in a clean Passaic River, but it's important that we keep this work up for them. So, you know, you can also see on this map the PVSC, which is the Passaic Valley Sewerage Commission, the Ironbound community, the Essex County facility, and also right near that Essex County facility is Delaney Hall, which even back then was used as immigrant detention and continues to be now. Next slide, please. So this is what that area looked like during Sandy. It was almost completely underwater. So you have the super polluted river, the nearby chemical facilities, which we haven't really addressed, but this area also has many, because of the way it's zoned, it has many chemical facilities that are basically nestled between people's homes. The sewage from PVSC, because this is also a combined sewer city, you had all of that flowing into streets and basements during Sandy. And so, you know, everyday people were exposed to toxic chemicals and sewage, as were the inmates and the staff at those facilities that we mentioned, the Essex County Correctional Facility and the Delaney Hall. And, you know, it's as terrible as it sounds, right? And again, you know, this is what happens when you have, or, you know, climate burden or environmental burden communities during climate disasters. Next slide, please. So these are additional contaminated sites in that section of the Ironbound. This is a section called the Triangle that was really badly damaged by flooding. And also is the section where we saw the Blue Acres program buyouts that I think we'll go a little bit into when we look at the tool with Amy. And some of those buyouts became green infrastructure pilots, but generally, you know, this community and many communities like it never completely recovered. Next slide, please. And, you know, I just included this one because, you know, there were many results. You know, for us, it was like days without access to supermarkets, days without access to power. You know, my whole family actually picked up and moved into the Ironbound organizers home for a few days that I mentioned. You know, and that was what it was. It was community cohesion that really kept us afloat. You know, a friend just came by and knocked on our door and said, "Are you okay?" Right? It wasn't FEMA. There was no, unfortunately, response from the city. I think it would be different today, but at that time, there was no response. There was no information. You know, people were just alone. And so, these are the events that really call people into work. And I know, in a conversation with Amy, it was similar for her and probably for some of you out there. And so, yeah, I just wanted to take a minute to, also say that there are many resources now, being developed to help us understand, where the risks are, and how we can address them. In addition to the tool being, demonstrated by Rebuild by Design, there's also the NJ Climate Resource Center that has their sea level rise reports that are very technical. But for those of you who do this for a living, I'm sure you are all utilizing them. NJEJA is also working with the DEP on coastal flooding mitigation and education. We're also working with a team from Rutgers on to prototype a public-facing tool that layers flood risk with environmental hazards from some of these Title V facilities, which I think is going to be very important. The communities that have these polluting facilities and contaminated land, really understand their flood risks. But there's just so much work to be done. So I'm really excited that we have yet another tool from Rebuild by Design, and looking forward to working together to bring this information out to more communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to just come back on camera in a sec. There I am. Wow. I mean, I just feel like I need to take a second after seeing those images again. And those images are stored in our brains, and when they come up, it's always a kind of a stark reminder of why we're doing this work and how much is at stake. You've said a lot of things that were super interesting, and I want to touch on a bunch of them, but I'd love to start in this, like, the truth that community always responds first. And wondering, we have these slow moving disasters, and then we have these moments of like a disruption, and wondering how you're able to, or how the Environmental Justice Alliance is able to hold them both at the same time. Like, how are you able to react to something that's happening every single day, and then also be able to be there for the big disasters?
I mean, that's a really good question. So, um, I think first of all, I really sort of find the models of organizations that are good at that, good at both building social cohesion and community connection, and also responding to disasters. And I mentioned Uprose in New York City is one of them. And we try to model that. I really do, to the best of my ability, because we are one organization, a small one at that. We know we cannot be everywhere. We cannot be everything. And it's going to be communities that are going to have to build the infrastructure that they need. So that's kind of where we are trying to come in. As I mentioned, our bread and butter has been for a long time environmental policy. We focus very heavily on air pollution from the energy, transportation, and waste sector. What I brought to the table in my tenure here, through my learnings and interactions with folks, at NJEJA before me and throughout the country, is the need to also focus on infrastructure. So we were very much part of the ecosystem of organizations that had applied for federal funding through the IRA. We got federal funding. We were on about 5 different grants, that were addressing a number of issues, from energy infrastructure to flooding to community building. And, that all sort of evaporated for the most part, which is really tragic. But communities still have dreams, right? What that moment did is that it helped us to really dream about infrastructure, right? We never, communities didn't have, never had an opportunity to think about and plan out the kinds of infrastructure that they wanted to see. So some communities really had the chance to do that and others haven't yet. And so that's where we're sort of on the, encouraging the development of these kind of community plans. Doesn't always involve us, right? We're one organization, but we want to try to be the connective tissue and the supportive part of the supportive infrastructure that gets communities to dream and design for themselves.
And to be ready for the next opportunity. Whether it's,
Right.
the federal government will have new programs hopefully in the future. And also the state, we hope will have infrastructure funding in the future.
Yeah.
And
But you
curious,
need
like,
to have those plans, right? Like what we
yeah, you
said, if
have to.
you're not ready when the opportunity comes, then it passes you by. And it's unfortunate that that's the case, right?
I
But
remember,
yeah.
yeah, I remember after Rebuild by Design, we worked with the city of Boston. They were actually the first city that we worked with after the Sandy region. And it was just a couple of years after the 2008, 2009 crisis and the ARPA money. No, was that what it was called? I can't remember what it was called back then. But the money that came, to kind of boost the economies, the local economies in the local states. And I don't remember if the city of Boston or the state of Massachusetts had a regulation that you can't do planning without the implementation dollars.
Mm.
And that was because they were spending a lot of money on planning that plans didn't really go anywhere. But what happened is after that financial crisis, the federal government was giving money for plans that were already plans that could be implemented. So they're basically, I think they were called off the shelf. They're like, if you have a plan that you can take off the shelf, we will give federal funding towards that. And the city of Boston was, basically recognized that they weren't able to get that federal funding because they didn't have those plans off the shelf. And I think back to my organizing days, and I'm sure you see this too, is sometimes you have to just be ready. And you have to be ready for that opportunity that opens where you can come in and say, here's something that our community is ready for, and we want these dollars, and we're ready to take them.
Yeah, I mean, my people say if you stay ready, so you don't have to get ready. You don't get ready, we stay ready.
I love that.
It's
Can I adopt that
right.
of my mantra in life?
Absolutely public domain. But yeah, for communities, EJ communities, Black and Brown communities, the ability to dream is revolutionary. So, when you have experienced redlining, white flight, just disinvestment, there are gaps between your, where you are now and what you can even envision. And so, I feel like the role of organizations on the ground is to help push the community's vision forward into, not what is like just probable or possible, but like what do we need to thrive? What do we need to be able to stay in place? What do we need to save our homes, to rebuild our communities, and that's where in that gap between government and people, organizations like ours come in, to help fill those holes, and help bring people into new vision for themselves and their communities.
I'm curious how your organization influences government, whether it's local government or state government, and if you have any examples that you could share.
Yeah, we do. We have a long history of influencing government around air quality, air pollution, climate mitigation policy, making sure that climate mitigation policy actually reaches the communities that are most impacted. Because unfortunately, sometimes climate mitigation policy can take this greater good approach, or this market-based approach, which we feel like is even more dangerous when we leave it up to the market to decide what happens in our communities with around air or water. Being situated as we are, we know that many of our partner communities around the country don't believe in the commodification of air or water, and they see the dangers in leaving it up to the market to decide what happens in our communities. So we've been pushing for decades to make sure that communities that are most impacted, that they're at the table, that, you know, that they're represented, that their voices are heard. And we basically do that through direct contact with our state agencies like the Department of Environmental Protection, which has its own Office of Environmental Justice, which is something that, you know, activists in this state really pushed for and have been working with the DEP to develop that office for years. And the EJAC, the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, you know, was another way that activists throughout the state and organizers throughout the state speak directly to government about their needs. Now, every agency isn't as accessible, right? We have some agencies that have a more robust practice of speaking directly to communities like the DEP has, and others that don't, you know, that have very little community input. But when we see those opportunities, we jump on them. And then we don't just jump on them. We say, okay, who else can come along, right? Because it should never just be us, right? It is not about us. So, you know, we want to say, okay, are you talking to this organization or that organization or this community leader? So that we get as many people that are representative of communities at the table. And that, you know, that's really how we influence, by building power, right? We want to bring people together because our voices together are always going to be much louder.
Yes, for sure. I'm curious, there's a lot going on in New Jersey. There's a huge affordability crisis that is compounding all of the other crises that were already there or have been there for a long time. Um, I'm curious, like, can you choose one, two, three of your top concerns for the state of New Jersey? Like, if you had a magic wand, what are you asking for?
I mean, Melissa, you know, Melissa's top concerns. There's Melissa's top concerns. There's probably like the organizational top concerns. I mean, education is a big one for me, is the one that comes to mind first, because we see so many school districts around the state are making these dramatic and drastic cuts. And, you know, at the same time where we have this sort of federal push against education and this shrinkage of government, I don't know what it's going to mean for future generations if, you know, they do not have access to solid public education. So I would say education is probably the number one on my mind. And, you know, as I mentioned, my background is in out of school time. We always understood that school alone was not enough, but school is the core, right? School is the foundation of the education that we are providing for young people that they're expecting. So when school is so woefully inadequate, again, that's going to put a lot of stress on parents and communities. But, you know, that's part of the infrastructure we have to build. The climate ready infrastructure we have to build is education, is part of that. Um, Energy is always a big one. You know, energy should be free. You know, energy should be part of the public
I love that.
commons, right? But we keep replicating systems. Even in our clean energy struggles, we keep replicating systems of oppression. So, you know, we're going to have to figure that out, because there's no reason why energy should be unaffordable. You know, the systems are designed that way. Uh, and yeah, so that's a big one. And then I would put together in one category heat and flooding, because those are the main, I think, climate concerns for New Jersey. Those are the things that are happening right now, that are taking lives now, is flooding and heat. And heat is a very silent killer. Like, we don't even have the kind of data we need around, you know, heat deaths and heat impacts. But, you know, that's one, particularly in low income communities and rural communities, you know, we're going to see a lot of impact. So those, I would say, are my top three.
Mhm. You touched upon this, and maybe we could ask Johanna, who's also here to help, to bring up the map of Newark. I'm kind of curious to look at the areas that were bought out. So you were saying that some of your community has been bought out and have experienced the Blue Acres program. The Blue Acres program in New Jersey, just so everybody knows, uses tax dollars, government dollars, and able to buy people out from areas that have already flooded, um, and to move them to a place that is hopefully safer. And, there's like this big pull. I remember after Sandy, I'm curious if you heard this too. After Sandy, the first thing that we saw was that people were like, we're building back, we're going to stay. And the most important thing is that our communities are here and we stay. And little by little, and Blue Acres, I think, started in the 1980s in New Jersey. I could be wrong. But little by little, we're actually seeing communities asking for buyouts. And I'm curious to know if you know anybody that's been bought out in this area. And maybe we could zoom in, Johanna, into the Blue Acres to see the areas that have been bought out.
Yeah,
Take a look at
I'd
Essex,
love
take a
to
look at Newark.
get to the
Uh-huh.
triangle because that's where I know,
Mhm.
while I believe it was before I became part of the EJ team at Ironbound, I was working in other departments with them for a while. But the EJ team was working on those pilots, those green infrastructure pilots in that area called the Triangle, and that was part of the Blue Acres program. So they bought out the homeowners, and then they did those pilots there. But yeah,
I mean, I think of them as the first
they-
level of
um,
displacement, right? So these are the people that have already been displaced by flooding. A lot in our map, our map's created to show what could possibly happen to more and more people. And that's kind of interesting to look at that, the river over there, because there's been a lot of buyouts already in that area.
I didn't realize there'd been so many. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time that we think that anybody has actually mapped it, and we were shocked at how.
Mhm.
I mean, to be honest, New Jersey has an incredible program that other states look to. So this is, it's bad news that people have had to be bought out, but it's good news for the people of New Jersey that New Jersey has this program that's able to do this, and a lot of states are looking to replicate what New Jersey has done.
Mhm.
When we were talking about the map, and I showed this to you for the first time, we zeroed in on Atlantic City, and maybe that's a place to like jump into the city map,
Mhm.
Johanna. We can maybe do there. Look at Atlantic City. And I'm curious why you zeroed in on Atlantic City. What are the connections there? And if you're shocked to see that almost all, I think 98% of infrastructure in Atlantic City are going to be in a flood zone by the 2050. And this is what it looks like. And maybe, John, you can kind of zoom in and see
Yeah.
what those dots represent.
Yeah, I think when we spoke, I had just come back from like two successive trips to Atlantic City. And as I mentioned, I'm a native New Yorker, and then I was a North Jersey person. I knew my way to New York for a long time, and I did not know the state. But as I started to travel the state, Atlantic City really touched me as a place that has been really, underdeveloped in many ways. Um, and but with like I think also I'm a person that really relates to people's hearts. When I go a place and I see people really genuinely striving to build community, to stay in place, it really touches me. So, you have this like convergence of long-standing historic, particularly Black communities, right? You have an African Methodist church, one of the first in the state. You have the NAACP. You have different Islamic masjids with history in the Black community. And then you have like all of these casinos built on contaminated lands. And you have a place where particularly Black communities are hyper segregated, really from like the start of Atlantic City being a place, where Black people could not use the same facilities, the same beaches. um so where you have this kind of story, there's always going to be, I find that the environmental and the climate impacts are just layered. And so I think what most interested me about this tool is that it looks at both the flood risk and it looks at the communities that are less at risk of flooding, but also at risk of displacement, right? When you have flooding, you're also going to have the conversation around displacement. So, I'm really always interested both in bringing more information, but more visibility to Atlantic City as a place that has, thriving community, but is, often out of the limelight, right? We have a city like Newark which again is my organizing home, but I understand Newark benefits from being part of the tri-state area. You know, Newark benefits from having massive transportation hubs and
Mhm.
infrastructure and being like the most populous city and having, you know, this dynamic mayor, like,
Mhm.
you know, but as a statewide organization, it's also our responsibility to shine light where that light hasn't been shown in the right ways, right? So yeah, I'm really hoping to be able to use this tool and some of the others that I mentioned to work with folks, you know, to figure out how community is going to advocate for themselves looking at a map like this. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually the most kind of important piece of this. And the reason why we did it is so people can advocate for themselves, so they can understand the risks to their local communities and the risk to their infrastructure that they depend on, which isn't just their house. It's also the wastewater treatment plant and the schools and the hospitals that they're going to need in time of crisis. So, Johanna, thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate that. We have a question um, from the audience that comes right after what you were just saying. And the question is, I'm curious to know what role that the faith communities has played in your work, especially around climate disaster response and preparedness.
That's a really great question. So until recently, I would say we weren't working so closely with faith-based organizations. But it's definitely a focus of mine more recently because as we mentioned, places like Atlantic City, you know, those are my connections in Atlantic City are the faith communities. And, you know, so we found faith communities, historic societies, you know, are places where people are actively working to preserve community are going to be critical. Also, you know, one thing we haven't touched on so much in this conversation is the idea of like, you know, climate hubs or sustainability hubs or community hubs, places where during, you know, that are sort of with infrastructure that is prepared for climate shocks and for moments of climate instability. And churches and community centers, historic foundations sometimes have, you know, the property or the buildings that can serve those purposes. So, you know, that is something we are definitely, you know, I'm really interested in expanding our work with those kinds of entities.
I'm going to put in the chat also just a plug for Rebuild by Design's Faith Toolkit, where we worked with the faith community. And that has everything from like understanding what climate is, what the risks are, to sample sermons,
Mm,
to, you know, we kind of did it all and we did it like really hand in glove. So big shout out to NIDIS, the New York State Disaster Interfaith Services, who was an incredible partner, and all the amazing people that we worked with, including Johanna, who ran that for Rebuild. So thank you for that.
York,
Um,
York with all of their resources. And actually I'm the board chair for an organization called Faithfully Sustainable that was part of that.
that was, yes.
They are a faith-based organization and they're working specifically with some masjids in the Bronx around
Yes.
flooding. So, you know, I know that has been a really great tool for that organization.
And I loved them. I loved getting to know them, and it's been really a wonderful ride. A few last questions. One, if the state were to do a big $3 billion bond act to support infrastructure, like how could it support environmental justice communities? What would you want to spend it on?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's not definitely not about what I want to spend it on. Like, I mean, but we need community voices, right? So the one thing I would say is we need to hold those community conversations. And we need to find out what people see, right? Those planning processes that may or may not have happened. People need clear information on, you know, what is happening now, why it's happening in terms of flooding, whether it's inland flooding, sunny day flooding, coastal sea level rise, you know, whatever it is, they need clear information, they need clear pathways, and they need to be able to make those decisions and figure out how they want to use infrastructure dollars, you know, either to relocate or to reinforce or what have you. And I think that would be the most important thing in that, you know, and that there is a focus on communities that have been historically disenfranchised because they have less resource to begin with. Like we're not all starting from the same place. And so we need to acknowledge that.
I really love that you didn't answer my question about physical infrastructure with the physical infrastructure answer. You said, I want a seat at the table, and we want our community members to
People
have a seat at the
infrastructure.
table, right? We want to build that table together and
People are
figure
the
out
most important infrastructure. You like
which.
it doesn't even
Mhm.
matter what your infrastructure looks like if people are not united and they're not, if they can't come together to work together, particularly in critical moments. But you don't get the critical moment results if you haven't built that infrastructure amongst people first.
I totally agree. Two quick things. One, how can people get involved? How can people donate? How can people volunteer? What are you looking for, or what do you need help with?
We love donations and volunteers. So yes, I think if you, Johanna, can pull up my third slide again, it has our socials. We're on all social media, Instagram. You can find me on LinkedIn, Melissa Miles, New Jersey. You can find me easily. We definitely are looking for volunteers. You can also donate at our page, your time or resources. You can connect with me directly if you would like to become a sustaining contributor to our organization and our work. Um, and and also, we're always interested in talking with community-based partners. So if you are part of an organization, you don't have to be a C3, but any kind of like group of people in a community that is on the DEP's OBC list, which is most of us.
Say that
Um,
again. The DEP's
the
what?
DEP's overburdened communities list, then feel free to reach out and we can have a chat and see if there are ways that we can partner.
That's awesome. My last question to you is, what are you hopeful about? Sometimes it feels doom and gloom, but there's actually so much to hope. There's so
Mm-hmm.
much hope around us. Curious what you're hopeful about.
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about so many things. I'm hopeful because honestly, I get to do this every day. This is what actually brings me hope. When I was just watching things happen, feeling climate anxiety, not quite sure what was next, that was pretty scary and depressing. But when you throw yourself in the fray, you don't have time to worry. You just keep it moving. And so, the fact that so many people are being drawn to this, that there's so many eyes on climate and climate work right now, definitely makes me feel hopeful. Just doing the work, honestly, is what makes me feel hopeful. So if you're out there feeling worried and depressed, just it means you gotta lock in, like my kids say, lock in.
I agree. It's really hard, but there's just so much work that's happening out there, and there's so much energy, and the energy that you can get from just being around other people with energy is everything. So thank you so much for coming. Really, really, really appreciate it. Big clap for everybody here. Big shout out. Everyone, please donate, help, do everything, Melissa, for Melissa and the community. And I also just wanted to give a little plug for our next event, which is next month, with Mayor Bush from Metuchen, New Jersey, who's just going to talk about what it's like being a local mayor that is dealing with some of these issues. So thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Aaliyah and Johanna. Thank you all for coming and for supporting our work too at Rebuild. And we will have the video of this event in a couple of days on our website. And if you need to reach us, we're at info@rebuildbydesign.org. Have a great rest of your day.